Hello everyone, it's Theme Park Avenue, I'm Eric. Two of my favorite theme parks in the US are Busch Gardens Tampa and Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Busch Gardens Tampa, or BGT, is my home park. I've gone many times over the last 16 years, and it's still one of the best parks in the US in my opinion. However, I've also been to Busch Gardens Williamsburg, or BGW, 3 times. Once in 2012, once in 2023, and once just last month. I love this park too, with my last 2 visits being among my favorites to any park ever. These 2 parks are often compared to each other for obvious reasons. There are direct similarities in both being Busch Gardens parks, having similar ride lineups, and both having an overarching theme to a foreign continent. However, there are some fun contrasts between the parks as well. BGT is themed to Africa, with a big focus on animals and zoological experiences. Busch Gardens Williamsburg is themed to Europe, with very few animals but much more detailed and cohesive architecture. So clearly, the parks have both similar strengths and some unique ones. And in this video, I am comparing the 2 to determine which Busch Gardens is the best. I did this matchup in a park battle nearly 5 years ago, and a rematch is long overdue. Some much prefer one park, some much prefer the other, but I think it's a very close call. And for the actual matchups, I will be splitting the park experience into some categories. I'll discuss which park is superior in each category, and declare an overall winner. It's not based on a point system, but I will keep track of who wins each category throughout, just for your sake. With all that out of the way, let's begin with my favorite category, the roller coasters. I recently made a video about the best roller coaster lineups in the US, and one of these parks made it while the other didn't. However, the omitted park was very close to the list, and so many people commented about that park's omission, so clearly, this will be a fun fight. I'll be keeping a secret which one won in that video, but I will encourage you to check that one out after this. Let's talk about the quantity of roller coasters. Scorpion at Busch Gardens Tampa was just removed, knocking that lineup down to 9 total coasters. Currently, Williamsburg has 10, but they are getting the new Wolf's Revenge just next month. So this is basically an 11-9 battle. But let's compare the quality of the roller coasters. For this section, I'm putting my rankings within the park side by side, comparing the number 1s, number 2s, and so on at each park. This is what I get when I do that. For number 1s, we have Iron Gwazi in Tampa and Pantheon at Williamsburg. Iron Gwazi is my favorite roller coaster. It's an incredible RMC hybrid with absolutely insane elements. And while Pantheon is certainly excellent, in my top 25 in fact, and one of the best launch coasters I've ever done, I will be giving Iron Gwazi the edge there. For the second place coasters, it's the 2 B&M inverts, Montu and Alpengeist. Busch Gardens Tampa's Montu is superior to me, as while it is a fairly close call, Alpengeist having similar strengths, Montu feels more complete, having stronger pacing, and an even more intense element than Alpengeist's Cobra roll in the Batwing. Now for the third best in the park, it's the 2 dive coasters, Sheikra and Griffin. Williamsburg's Griffin takes this one, for the second inversion and airtime hill possibly being the best parts of the ride. It's just generally more thrilling and memorable than Sheikra. For fourth place, we have 2 other B&M roller coasters, Kumba and Apollo's Chariot. Kumba is an intense looping coaster, Apollo's Chariot is a more tame but very fun hyper coaster. The original B&M Hyper in fact. For me, Apollo's Chariot is slightly better. For 5th place, we have 2 coasters that are generally considered family coasters, Cheetah Hunt and Invader. Cheetah Hunt in Tampa is a beautiful ride, very scenic, a long experience, well-paced, and tons of fun. While not perfect, I would take it over Invader, as while I like Invader a lot, the ride is not quite as well-paced, and generally is a bit less memorable. For 6th place, I would have had Cobra's Curse and Tempesto, but these 2 rides are simply so different that I'll swap the matchup just so this all makes more sense. Instead of Cobra's Curse, Busch Gardens Tampa will put forth Tigris. The same ride model as Tempesto, but a far more uncomfortable experience for whatever reason, so that's a point for Tempesto easily. For 7th place, we have Cobra's Curse instead, And my actual 7th at Busch Gardens Williamsburg is Verbolten, an unpopular take. And I did not get a redemption ride in 2025, unfortunately, but in 2023, I found the indoor portion to not be as thrilling as many have said, and I'm not really a big fan of the way they did the theming. So while it is a good family coaster, I just don't think it's quite as thrilling to back up the great praise it gets. And for me, Cobra's Curse is generally a more fun experience. Similar caliber of theming in my opinion, and frankly, a little more fun and memorable. And for the final matchup, the 8th place coasters are Loch Ness Monster and Phoenix Rising. Phoenix Rising is a great family inverted coaster, but Loch Ness Monster is one of the best aero loopers out there, and is definitely a good step above Phoenix Rising. Now I can add an extra point for Wolf's Revenge and Dark Coaster to that, but even without the extra coasters, Busch Gardens Williamsburg wins 5-4. And if it were to get those 2 extra points, 7-4. So yeah, this definitely seems like Busch Gardens Williamsburg should be winning. But like I said at the beginning, I'm not reducing this to a point system. That's just not my style anymore. I just wasn't really sure the best way to go about comparing all these different rides, so I thought that was a good way to sort of summarize this. And there's ultimately one roller coaster on here that makes the big difference in terms of who wins and who doesn't. Busch Gardens Williamsburg has more coasters, and every major coaster there is much better than Tigris. Even Dark Coaster, which I don't love. In terms of the family coasters, I do think Cobra's Curse and Phoenix Rising are a better double punch than Invader and Dark Coaster. However, it's worth noting that Wolf's Revenge will also be a family coaster, so solely based on family stuff, I think Busch Gardens Williamsburg will be winning pretty soon. But the key disparity here is closer to the top of the list. Based on the top 5 coasters alone, Busch Gardens Tampa certainly wins for me. While I do prefer the Dive Coaster and the 3rd place B&Ms from Busch Gardens Williamsburg, Cheetah Hunt is way stronger than Invader, and certainly the top 2 won at BGT, so that is clear why I do think the top 5 and the overall lineup might lean toward Tampa. Montu is overall stronger than Alpengeist, but that is kinda close. It ultimately comes down to number 1. I love Pantheon, but as I said, Iron Gwazi is my favorite roller coaster. And I think if the fight for number 1 was even, whether Busch Gardens Tampa had a launch coaster, or Busch Gardens Williamsburg had a top 2 RMC, this would go to Williamsburg. However, Iron Gwazi is just that good to me, and I do still believe at this moment, though I guess it could theoretically change if I ever get on Wolf's Revenge, that Busch Gardens Tampa has the better roller coasters than Busch Gardens Williamsburg. It is a close call, and it might have been less close if that number 1 thing was even, as I was saying. But nonetheless, Iron Gwazi is the king, and for that reason, I lean toward Busch Gardens Tampa. Let's talk about other rides. There is a wide variety besides the roller coasters at the parks, but not as wide as there could be. Williamsburg used to have dark rides, but they are both gone. So we have to compare just the flat rides, water rides, family rides, and transportation rides. For flat rides, each park has standard solid bumper cars, but Williamsburg has a higher quantity of flat rides thanks to things like Der Wirbelwind, Le Catapult, the Trade Wind, and the Battering Ram. These are fun standard flat rides that do help Busch Gardens Williamsburg. However, the more thrilling flat rides favor Tampa. I prefer Serengeti Flyer to Finnegan's Flyer by a tiny bit in terms of the thrill alone. And it's Falcon's Fury, the drop tower, that really comes in to blow the rest of the rides away. It is an insane drop tower, currently my favorite I've ever done. Maybe below Zumanjaro, but that is now gone at Six Flags Great Adventure. So for this reason, flat rides do lean toward Busch Gardens Tampa. In terms of water rides, the edge has to go to Busch Gardens Williamsburg. River Rapids and Log Flume may be a toss-up at the 2 parks, though I do think Les Scoot is more scenic than Stanley Falls. However, it's the additional Escape from Pompeii, the best water ride of the entire bunch, that makes sure Williamsburg gets the win. In terms of family rides, the other flat rides I named at Busch Gardens Williamsburg might classify, but I'm only talking about those in one category, so let's just move on to some others. Williamsburg has the Kinder Carousel, and it counters the Busch Gardens Tampa carousel nicely enough. That's essentially a tie. But otherwise, Busch Gardens Tampa is lacking. They have gwazi gliders and a fairly expansive kids area, but Williamsburg has 2 kids areas, and that combination is a little bit stronger. And finally, the transportation rides. This is the most interesting one, because these 2 parks have wonderful train rides. Both are excellent, and frankly among my favorite rides in both parks. Busch Gardens Tampa's Serengeti Railway takes you into the main Serengeti Plain, where you can see the giraffes, zebras, rhinos, and so on, and get a great scenic tour of the entire park. However, Busch Gardens Williamsburg wins. If you saw my video about the top 10 rides at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, you know how much I love the train. The train is gorgeous, gives you some of the best views of any theme park, and simply put, there was no way any other train I've ever been on at a theme park could compete. I do want to note that both parks do have a sky ride, and the sky ride's great too. But Busch Gardens Tampa's is currently in upcharge, and Williamsburg's is standing but not operating. That sucks, as those rides were awesome. They're not going to be counted in this video because of their current situation, but I wanted to shout them out. In terms of the non-roller coaster rides, Falcon's Fury is not quite enough to beat the Williamsburg quantity, and I might even prefer the Busch Gardens Railway to Falcon's Fury. That alone does give Williamsburg this edge. So we've talked about the main strengths that these parks share. However, it's time to talk about the unique strengths: appearance and animals. Starting with appearance, both parks do look great. Busch Gardens Tampa has excellent landscaping throughout, and areas like Egypt, Stanleyville, and especially Pantopia have distinct appearances with wonderful architecture and theming. It's a big step up from most American parks. However, Busch Gardens Williamsburg is a step up from that, and up from many parks around the world. It's been voted the most beautiful park in the world, and I think, at the very least, it's the most beautiful in the US that I've been to, even against Dollywood, Silver Dollar City, and Islands of Adventure. The theming is breathtaking, with every section looking the part to a great degree. Some areas do have minimal theming, but the European theme does have a more elaborate and flashy appearance overall, compared to the somewhat more bare-bones Busch Gardens Tampa stuff. The best areas are stellar, those being San Marco in Italy, Banbury Cross in England, Killarney in Ireland, and Rheinberg in Germany. The buildings all look the part and have beautiful nature as their boundaries, which leads into the real reason why the park is way more beautiful. Busch Gardens Tampa is in a large, flat plot of land in the middle of a suburb north of Tampa, Florida. Not the most interesting location, and there's not that much to do with it. They do have the great Serengeti Plain that does look gorgeous, and they do make the park somewhat interesting by having some elevation differences. You do have to go up a bit of a ramp to get out of Pantopia on the back. And I like that Kumba kind of has its own back area, and when Wild Oasis opens in place of Jungala, that area will look great too. However, no expansive grasslands or secluded areas can quite compete with the location of Williamsburg. The park is nearby Colonial Williamsburg and several historic sites, and the history of that area is worth visiting on its own. Williamsburg itself is not as touristy as other nearby cities of major parks like Sandusky, Ohio, or Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and the surrounding National Park Service properties, such as those in Jamestown, give the area genuine character. But you're not here to learn about that, you're here to learn about Busch Gardens. Well, let me tell you, when you reach the top of Griffin's Lift Hill and look out toward the James River just a mile away, it's unbelievable. No view from a Busch Gardens Tampa ride, or maybe any ride frankly, can quite compare to that. The surrounding area of the park is simply gorgeous, and it's much more quiet and forested than Tampa. Then there's the park itself, which is also well forested. It's dense with gorgeous foliage, and is probably the best landscaping I've seen in a US park. It's stellar to look at, further aided by the Rhine River running through the park. The Rhine River is actually a creek, but it feels so grand, and the way so many of the roller coasters come close to it and interact with the ravine, it's unbelievable. There's a reason why Loch Ness Monster's loops are so iconic. And while kumbas are too, I think a view of the river from the train bridge or the footbridge are the best views you can get in a theme park, period. At least that I've experienced so far. And Busch Gardens Tampa simply can't compete on the appearance front. A big win for Busch Gardens Williamsburg. But Busch Gardens Tampa, while it does get somewhat swept in that department, claps back with the animals. Busch Gardens Williamsburg has an eagle sanctuary, which I enjoy, some stables with Clydesdales, and gray wolves that you might even get to see. When I was there, I only saw one for a couple of seconds. These are all nice, and there are some good opportunities to learn about them, but one of Busch Gardens Tampa's biggest focuses is the animals. The park houses over 200 species, and there are incredible exhibits all around that can be just as fun as the roller coasters. There's great individual exhibits, with African penguins, cheetahs, tigers, and elephants. But what I love most is the more secluded animal attractions they have between some of the major thrilling areas. For example, if you walk from Cobra's Curse to Falcon's Fury, you pass a great view of the Serengeti, full of giraffes and zebras, small meerkat and porcupine exhibits, the Edge of Africa, which contains hippos, hyenas, and lions, the Animal Care Center, where injured animals are taken care of, and the elephants, all on a 10-15 minute walk. The trail is brilliantly designed and full of educational opportunities. It's also generally quite quiet and tranquil, though it may have some kids yelling, but that's because they're enjoying the animals. Other great exhibits include Mayambi Reserve with gorillas and chimpanzees, and Walkabout Way with kangaroos, though that one is under refurbishment as of my last visit. I don't think the animal attractions quite enhance the park as much as the location of Williamsburg, but it's not far off. So those are the main categories I wanted to discuss. And if I were doing a point system to determine who's the winner, we'd have a tie. Before declaring a winner though, I want to briefly talk about a few other noteworthy categories. First off, food. I don't prioritize food at theme parks, but some do, and you might be interested in knowing which one is the better food, and I would give the edge to Williamsburg. Both parks have exceptional pretzels, with Twisted Tail pretzels at Busch Gardens Tampa being my favorite food of any theme park. Twisted Tail is a more iconic place than the pretzel place at Williamsburg, and that's frankly why it gets the edge. However, my meal at Fest House at Williamsburg was better than any other food I had at Tampa. Zambia's Smokehouse in Tampa admittedly has gone a little downhill, and the European offerings at Williamsburg fit the theme of the park better, and that does make the dining experience feel a little more immersive. That's a minor thing for Busch Gardens. I mean, the Tampa restaurants, though, they do feel a little more like cafeterias just in the middle of the park, and while they don't taste bad, Williamsburg's restaurants feel a little more authentic, and that's an added bonus. The other key category is operations. The reason I separated it from the main categories is that it's simply too variable for me to decide a winner. I have had great and terrible operation experiences at both parks. Obviously, I've been to Tampa many times, far more times, and they've lately had consistent issues. Cheetah Hunt's always down, Iron Gwazi takes forever to load, Cobra's Curse often has a very long line, and Kumba's just never open. That said, my visit to the park in December had quite good operations. The lines moved very well, save for Cobra's Curse at the peak of the day. At Williamsburg, the operations in 2023 were consistently quite strong, save for a notable breakdown on Verbolten. However, my 2025 visit was much worse. Dark Coaster had one-train operations, which I find baffling given the low capacity and decently long ride experience. This was a Saturday and decently busy, but most coasters had very poor dispatches and very long lines. Of my many trips to Tampa, I can only recall 2 or 3 that had worse operations than this. It didn't ruin the day or anything, but it is worth noting that both of these parks have pretty inconsistent operations. And for that reason, I think this is the area that both parks need to brush up on the most, and it's the biggest issue with the guest experience. Neither park would have gotten a point, so now that we covered that, let's decide a winner. Busch Gardens Tampa is my home park. I've probably been there over 100 times. and I've considered it one of the best parks in the US for most of my life. However, a single trip to Williamsburg in 2023 won me over, and I also consider it to be one of the best parks in the US, going toe-to-toe with Busch Gardens Tampa even right in 2023. However, I had a much worse visit in 2025 due to the operations. That convinced me both parks are more than capable of offering great experiences, but can also sometimes be harder to fully enjoy if the operations aren't great. Ultimately, operation issues happen everywhere, and while some are preventable at these parks and you can plan around them by doing some research ahead of time and going on quieter days, they are pretty much inevitable. So when deciding a winner, I am basing this primarily off of the constants, the things that are always there and always good or bad, assuming all of the rides are open. And ultimately, I think that if you can have the perfect day at both parks, I think the superior Busch Gardens is Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Busch Gardens Tampa has the better headliner attraction for thrill seekers like myself and Iron Gwazi, but the superior theming and landscaping will probably speak to a lot of park goers much more, and to an extent, they spoke to me even more. If you much prefer a zoological park, or much prefer the roller coasters of Tampa, that park will be more up your alley. However, as an overall park experience, I am declaring Busch Gardens Williamsburg the better Busch Gardens. An impressive bar, though, as these are two of the very best theme parks in the country. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please comment down below your thought on the two Busch Gardens parks. Subscribe for more theme park videos. I'll see you next time.